The red line is hollow, this is already a fact, but the question is how hollow? With the current climate of the One Piece world, we are left to question how the world is sinking and what may happen in the near future. And for that, we really have to dig deep into some of the elements of the world building Oda has left us. And one of the biggest elements in the One Piece world is without a doubt the red line. This video will become a reference point for future videos, and we're going to discuss a bunch of the interesting parts of the red line that should definitely be considered in conversations moving forward. So starting off with the geographical reference point of the red line is that it divides up 4 blues along with the Grand Line with the calm belt in junction. Something that has been confusing but should be said at the start is that the direction of the seas do indicate the relative poles of the planet. So the North Pole is in the North Blue and the South Pole is in the South Blue, which is also supported by supplementary information like the fact that Surame is from the North Pole and is listed as originating from the North Blue, or the Heart Pirates originating from the frigid North Blue, which implies the North Pole. But also this map that Oda drew at the start of the series that clearly indicates that the red line runs from southwest to northeast. As far as what the red line is specifically, it's a giant continent that is made up of what seems to be a red stone, and it apparently runs continuously around the world, creating a giant band with 3 technical bypasses. The first one is the Reverse Mountain, then there's a tiny but big hole in Fishman Island, and then the last one is a technical one, but technically the red port has a giant gate that seems like it can open, but we've never seen it open. Instead, it seems like the only way around this is up and over via the gondolas. That being said, I don't fully buy what Papag tells us about this process in chapter 496, but he says that everyone leaves their ship behind and buys a similar one on the other side, which should probably describe how limited this method of travel probably is for the grand majority of approved travelers, an emphasis on approved because this method of coming through the red port requires government approval, since it basically is the entrance to Merijois and a government protected location, as we can see by giant insignia. Now there is a technical, or rather theoretical, 4th way around, but it would be better to explain what I mean after talking a little bit about Reverse Mountain and Fishman Island. So the first 2 very interesting things about both locations is that they are considered winter islands, which, if you don't remember, islands throughout the Grand Line have near permanent seasons determined, where each island experiences 4 seasons underneath the context of an overall climate. So technically there are 16 seasons within the Grand Line based on their islands, but then there's some exceptions to this, like the 48 season islands of Ruskaina that experiences a new season every week. But in general, the rule of thumb is that stable weather means that you are close to an island that has stabilized its climate, and it's the transition zones that have the most erratic weather. Now, going back to Reverse Mountain, Nami says it's a winter island, which means the rushing waters that go towards the red line are then pushed downwards. But as we know, there are 4 canals from each blue that move against gravity up the mountain that collide at the top and result in a downward river canal that leads into the Grand Line that starts with the Twin Capes, where Laboon is. It is of note that on the other side of this area would be around where the end of the Grand Line would be, where the Straw Hats are currently located and are destined to reach, meaning Lodestar, Elbaf, and probably Egghead and Wano. Interestingly, to focus back on Reverse Mountain though, there are these gates that seem to be guiding a passage throughout the canals. I'm not sure what real world reference these arcs are inspired from, but it is kind of hard to pin down since they are kind of unique. But at the minimum, we see this image of a weird faced fish repeated all over it. Also, despite it being a winter island, when we pass through the Reverse Mountain with the Straw Hats, it seems to be warm enough that the Straw Hats are wearing their normal clothes throughout the mountain pass. On top of that, I don't think we've ever seen Twin Cape snowing, whether it be in the cover stories when the Straw Hats were there or in Brook's flashback. And that kind of is the case with Fishman Island, that despite Nami calling it a severely winter island, we know that the ancient Fishman settlers chose this location for the Sunlight Tree Eve's blessing of providing sunlight and oxygen on the ocean floor, which makes it seem like this is the only place in the world where this happens. And because of this, along with the bubble, it seems that Fishman Island gets to enjoy its own climate separate from its geographical determination that Nami claimed it to have. And the reason to emphasize this winter island preset that both the entrances of the Grand Line have is the ocean currents that seem to follow suit. Going up to the red line to Reverse Mountain, we break physics and basically most of our normal understanding of logic by having 4 rivers that flow up a mountain that seems to be aided by extreme winds and the presence of a winter island. Similarly with Fishman Island, since it is a winter island and extremely cold, that provides a direct ocean current that funnels directly to it. Because of the increased salinity salinity and the depth of the ocean, creating a cold deep sea current, not only is this how Rayleigh recommends traveling to Fishman Island, but the reality is, with or without guidance, what we find out is that on the north side of Fishman Island is the Forest of the Sea, which has the graveyard of ships, which exists because the currents around the world brings all sunken ships to this one location, which I doubt this means all the ships that have sunk around the world will come here, because we have seen the Masira pirates scavenge for ships from the sea floor along with the Straw Hats, and it could be that eventually these ships would find their way to Fishman Island, but I'm taking it as any sunken ship that finds itself within a current would be brought here via the deep sea currents, because what we also find out from Frankie primarily is that all the oceans and seas and waters are connected via the deep sea currents. In fact, the deep current and the surface current connect like a dragon, which we covered pretty deeply in my Godfather Shanks video, where I had said that because the Roger pirates seemingly were prepared for life underwater, most likely because of what they learned from the Void Century, that it might be likely that Shanks took reign over these deep sea currents as the emperor of the underworld, with some of the deepest roots in the pirating game. Now that Vegapunk and Lily have confirmed the reality of the eventual sinking world, I would definitely go check the Godfather Shanks video, because it seems like a lot of the logic was substantiated, since we already knew back then a flood was most likely going to happen later in the series due to those details. All that being said, we mentioned the technical fourth pathway through the red line that is more theoretical than not, which is the uninterrupted dragon-like sea current. What Frankie says is that it flows all around the world uninterrupted, which means it crosses the calm belt and the red line and connects every ocean. And what's interesting about the potential is that if Frankie means that seriously, then sure, the hole through Fishman Island could allow for all the currents to pass through, but this could imply that there are other passages through the red line that we are unaware of, or much less common to use. And the reason why we can insinuate this possibility is for a couple of reasons, like if there was only one way through the red line, I'm sure the world government would want to police this passage way more strictly, especially since it directly is below them. But also because of instances like Marineford, where we see in the span of a day, Whitebeard and Shanks were able to make it to the other side of the red line from the New World in less than a day, and apparently these deep sea currents move very slowly, which I also elaborate on in the Shanks video, that it's most likely that Shanks utilized the White Strom to make it to Marineford. And there's a few more clues, like Umit, the Emperor of the Underworld, that is separate to the Yonkos, who recently showed up in Vegapunk's flashback. He's known for commanding the deep sea current for transportation, and if Fishman Island was the only passageway, I would imagine we'd see more of his presence there. But that's a stretch. Something that is more concrete actually comes from chapter 1, where we see that Shanks is talking to Luffy and he says, "We've been using this village as our base for about a year. After 2 or 3 more voyages, we'll leave for good and head north." Now, this line would breeze by most people, especially on a first read and even a reread, but the reality is Oda had a lot of the directional stuff down pat, as he gave us the map just 20 chapters later that made this extremely curious of a choice of direction for Shanks to say. Remember, Dawn Island, where Luffy is from, is in the East Blue, and the North Blue is on the other side of the red line. We know that Shanks eventually headquarters in Elbaf, which is in the New World of the Grand Line, and in order to go to Reverse Mountain, he would have to go southwest, the same way as the Straw Hats, and we know that ships are capable of going straight into the Calm Belt and even crossing into the Grand Line, as we saw of Dawn Krieg and Mihawk, and even the Navy has touted to do this, but Shanks says he is going north, which would make him hit the red line. And another note is that this isn't even where Meridra is, so his sneaky link with the Gorosei couldn't even be facilitated this way. And to address one other part is that we do know that there are other technicalities around the red line, like Big News Morgans and Witheria that fly, as well as Germa that uses giant snails to crawl over, which neither applies to what we've seen of Shanks. And so I explain all that to say that it's likely that Shanks has some kind of secret passage through the red line, that I explain more in depth in the Godfather Shanks video, which allows him the kind of influence over territory that would fit a Yonko, and enables him more mobility than most, and touches back on the odd nature that is the red line, which is the point of this video. So let's get back to the main topic here. A lot of these points will be brought up in other videos in various capacities, but if you've already learned something new, consider dropping a like for me and sharing this video, because we're about to talk specifically about the hollow nature of the red line and why it's so interesting. So moving to the composition of the red line, honestly, I have a few theories that are coming up that I'll redact for the moment, but from Nami, we know that the way we should consider the red line is that it's a bunch of interlocked islands of separate climates. So there are spring, summer, autumn, and winter islands, and seemingly they interchange. And as we mentioned before, in order to pass through the standard Grand Line line methods, we pass by 2 winter islands. But that's also interesting because the reverse mountain wasn't wintry, but neither was Meridjois. Meridjois and Redport are not winter islands despite Fishman Island being one, which for all of you theorists would probably be a really important point to consider for future videos because I know I'm considering it. But on top of that, we kind of figured that the red line is largely impenetrable. If it weren't, then I would imagine many would have tried to make passageways through the red line rather than the perilous ways through the reverse mountain and Fishman Island method, or even the really odd Redport method. And despite it being impenetrable, it is regarded to be incredibly durable, as Laboon could not even dent it. And powers like the Pawpaw Fruit, which can repel things at insanely fast speeds, also cannot just bypass this. That being said, there's still a hole created conveniently right below Meridjois, and there is that gate carved right into the side of Redport, which again we haven't seen open, but also at the top of Meridjois, right at the entrance from Redport, we see it's carved into, making it look like a castle top type of aesthetic, as well as there being stairs. And all this time I failed to mention the altitude of the red line, which we technically don't know, at least from what I've seen. It's never been directly said how high up Meridjois is. We know that from sea level to Fishman Island it's 30,000 feet below, but it isn't said from sea level to Meridjois. But to give a counter-reference, Sky Islands are about 30,000 feet in the sky, and Meridjois is just high enough that the bubbles from the Yarukiman mangrove trees at Redport do not reach the top, and so the bubbles pop up there. And another acknowledgement point here that would make sense to mention is the longevity of the red line. We can't be too certain of the entire history of the red line's existence, but since the world government was established 800 years ago, if this empty throne was placed back then where the oath of the 20 kings took place, then it would imply that the red line existed back then, but we can also apply its existence based off of Whitebeard's recollection of the assumed Lunarians' previous residence being also on top of the red line, and apparently dubbed the Land of the Gods. Also, while we don't know how old the globe at O'Hara is, it seems that 5,000 years of history is accumulated here, and the giant globe also reflected the existence of the red line in the image. So I think it's safe to say that this red line has been here for a long period of time and wasn't likely to be constructed during the Void Century or during the world government's reign, which now if we're to discuss the red line in depth, we can start with the weird nature it has with log poses. You would think such a giant structure would disrupt the magnetic polarity of the log poses, but it seems to operate kind of like a normal island in that Nami had to wait a certain amount of time to fill up the log pose, and when it was set, they found that they were going to Whiskey Peak, back with Crocus. I would imagine that if the red line is made up of separate islands, then it could have different polarities to latch onto, but this is something we also don't really know how it works, especially because at Fishman Island they use Fishman Island's polarity specifically to set their log pose, and they even said each island throughout the journey the magnetic directions could abruptly change, but there was no specific mention of the red line's effect in this regard. So maybe it is possible that the red line doesn't have an insane magnetic relevance, which is interesting on its own and we can extrapolate about later. As I mentioned before, we don't know what material the red line is made out of, but we do know that the forest at Meridjois is man-made, which is an interesting property in and of itself. A man-made forest here probably means the soil and trees were imported, probably intentionally, and kind of similar to Vars on Skypiea, where technically that soil was all foreign but allowed for a forest to grow. A significant difference here is that the red line forest is not wild and overgrown like the one we saw in Shandora in the sky after 400 years in the sky, which we established that Meridjois had to be here for at least 800 years, if not more, but if the world government is responsible for the man-made forest, then that's something we can garner some conclusions about. But that's not the only interesting thing about the red line that we can figure out from chapter 906. Another point to mention is that beneath the surface there's a whole underground city of some sort, where we see that instead of the travelators or horizontal escalators being powered by literally anything like cola or just fire, Meridjois decided to opt for the age-old source of power, manual labor. We were never given an exact estimate of how many slaves Meridjois had in total, but in order to facilitate all of this, I would imagine there's a huge facility beneath the surface of Meridjois that exists to house all of these people basically until their death. We also know that because of the raid on Meridjois by the Revolutionary Army, that food cannot be locally sourced, and it also has to be imported. All they have left after Sabo burned down the food storage is cake, it seems, and the Revolutionary Army is creating a perimeter around the ocean, preventing food supplies from reaching Mer Joie, which is incredibly telling about the supply channels. This kind of implies that a considerable amount of food can't be grown on the Red Line, even on a man-made forest, because you would imagine that they would farm horizontally across the Red Line, but maybe they are, and the Revs are also stopping these from being transported as well, but we have no concrete information about this. Now, another note to be made is that we know for sure that the Red Line has a depth that implies the hollow nature of the Red Line, in that there is a scene with Emu where we see them walking down a considerable depth to what seems like a frozen new area with seemingly endless doors lined up along the wall, where we find the giant or large straw hat simply sitting behind a technologically advanced looking metal preservation chamber of some sort. This is incredibly interesting because this location lines up way more with the true nature of what the Red Line here should be, given the opposite side at the reverse mountain is a winter island, and just below at Fishman Island, that's a winter island, and it would make sense if the island above it were a winter island too, but on the outside it doesn't appear to be the case. And so now we see that though the Red Line has been made to feel like this impervious object, we see the Redport gate carved into the side, then we see the top of the Red Line carved perfectly into this aesthetic entrance that is on a scale that makes the giant Neptune and Shirahoshi look like ants, honestly. And then we see the underground slave terminal, but we also technically see Morley move the Red Line and create a pocket where they can do some secretive planning and even most likely escape from. So it's not like the Red Line is impervious to devil fruits even. And it seems like the Red Line is not nutritious enough to support plant life to any degree. But that's where an odd thing exists, where we see that in Fishman Island, it's cozied up between two giant roots from what's theorized to be the Sunlight Tree Eve's roots, providing sunlight, and given the size and direction, these roots seemingly go straight up, which would make it that the Sunlight Tree Eve is growing into the Red Line. And we see no indication of this tree at Mer Joie or on the side of the Red Line, despite us getting visuals of what it looks like above Fishman Island. So it does beg the question of where Sunlight Tree Eve actually is, because what we can say that is based on the theory that Neptune tells us, this tree is providing the surface sunlight down to Fishman Island, and so they receive the same cycle as night and day of wherever the tree is, and we actually got this reflected in chapter 1114, where it seems to be nighttime in Mer Joie, Marineford, and Fishman Island. And we have seen previously where Fishman Island and Mer Joie were both illuminated at the same time. Now, I have a few theories about the Sunlight Tree on the way or posted already, so make sure to keep an eye out for those. But all of this to say that the Red Line does not appear to be solid, and according to the official digital coloring, the Sunlight Tree Eve roots seem to be white, which would make it very obvious if we had been able to see this tree contrasted on the Red Line. But none of this is even why we have to consider the Red Line to be extremely hollow. It actually comes from a really random person. Some of you may know, but most of you are going to be baffled because this is another one of those details that you breeze by and think nothing of, and I will admit that this character I would consider below Bogard on your spectrum of importance. So that being said, we get a wild detail about the Red Line that we kind of don't get a lot of context around, but once you sit with it, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And without further ado, the character is none other than the previous Fleet Admiral and current Commander-in-Chief, or the Supreme Commander of the World Government Military, Kong, who the only time we've ever seen in modern One Piece era is in chapter 594, and more specifically the focal point is that his office is in a very curious location. To give context, the chapter opens up in the Five Elders room, said to be in Sacred Mer Joie, the Red Line. They have a conversation and we pan out of that room to Pangaea Castle, with a statement from the narrator saying elsewhere on Sacred Mer Joie, with a quick transition to none other than Kong, who is speaking to Sengoku, who is in the middle of resigning post the Marineford War. And because we've discussed this, you may notice immediately what's odd here. If I put the panel in color, it becomes even more apparent that Kong's office is a giant aquarium. But remember, this is confirmed to be on Mer Joie. Now, I don't need to insult your intelligence, but this is so not normal that it is almost comical that this isn't talked about more. First of all, this is not your normal aquarium. It's massive. So massive that in the back, we see creatures that look like like sea kings. We see sharks that dwarf the office that they are sitting in. We even see surame, or rather a kraken type of octopus. And not just that, we see the ocean floor and what seems to be volcanoes. And while it's not pitch dark here, it does seem quite deep. Now, I consider that this is just sitting on top of the red line with Mer Joie, but this is massive. Not that we've seen all of Mer Joie, but I think a giant oceanic level aquarium would be visible from the top. But also, it wouldn't really make sense for this to be inside Pangaea Castle directly, because one, this would be huge, but also when you think about it, why would an insect like Kong be put on a permanent same level as the Celestial Dragons? Keep in mind, the Celestial Dragons live on top. Only the kings of the world government attend here with permission. And also imagine if Kong's office were in Pangaea Castle, then that would be the Gorosei giving Kong a room in their own castle that makes their own room look like a closet. So it would make sense that Kong's room is beneath the surface of Mer Joie, and this aquatic environment is somewhere within the red line. And I also say this because it has to be that this water is not easily accessible to the surface or the Celestial Dragons. The reason I say that is because if it were, then the food shortage that they have wouldn't make sense, since these large predator fish would have to feed on something, and if they couldn't fish for the sea king, sharks, or octopus, then any of the smaller fish would definitely help ease their food shortage, where they say they can only eat bread. And at the same time, I think this has to be separate from the Red Port, because we have seen the Red Port multiple times and it gets introduced as separate from Mer Joie, whereas Kong's office was said to be elsewhere on Mer Joie, and this is the same thing that was done when Imu started descending those steps to the frozen part of Mer Joie, that the narrator box simply said Mer Joie without any specificity. So from multiple angles, I think Kong has an office that Oda used in such a subtle way to show us a very unique mechanism of the red line, with a character that realistically showed up only one time. It's easy for most people to dismiss such an awesome character, and even makes most of us wonder why Oda even introduced him in the first place. But behind the muscles that makes Kaido look scrawny, and the stature that makes a Kainu look like a child, and a name that we normally associate with a king, we realize that Oda might have shown us a gold mine into understanding the world of One Piece. If this is indeed an aquatic nature within the red line, then it might be that the illumination that we see is provided by the sunlight tree Eve that starts at Fishman Island, and provides them with light and oxygen similarly to this aquarium that Kong seems to monopolize, since we've seen nearly no one else on Mer Joie even entertain something of this nature existing. And that's important to acknowledge, because imagine if they imported all of this just for Kong's office. I would think that Kong is a Celestial Dragon with that kind of pull. So it might be appropriate to now look at the red line less like a giant fortress of red rock, but rather a giant red cap with islands at the top, kind of like if you flipped Wano upside down. Now, this realization does not mean that the entire red line is hollow, but I do think that it's worth considering for at least the main parts of the red line that we normally refer to when talking about the red line. But also, if this was somehow being facilitated at Reverse Mountain, maybe then the mechanisms of how it works are way more intricate than we realize, because that would change the water pressure system entirely. I'm not saying that it would make it easier to understand, but maybe the entire red line filters and funnels water in a very complex way. And we have to recognize that everything that we've seen within the red line already is kind of advanced. Though they use slave labor, the entire mechanism is pretty advanced, something we've seen automated but mimicked at Egghead. Then we've seen some of the same technology when Imu goes downstairs that we'd see in Vegapunk's lab. And even if Kong's office weren't underground, this is really technologically advanced to facilitate something like this. So maybe the red line is much more complex than we thought, and maybe it is a giant technological contraption that has been facilitating some interesting function in the One Piece world that we have yet to understand. But for that discussion, subscribe, because I will definitely talk about that kind of thing in the future. Obviously, this would be important for the understanding of how the world is sinking, because if this is just filled up with water and it's somehow losing pressure, then when the water releases, maybe that's how you'd flood the entire planet. If the red line experienced any tectonic shifts or earthquakes, this would certainly destabilize everything, which is why this would be very healthy to consider in any context where Luffy destroys the red line. But also, Kong might be in one of the safest places if the world were to flood, and it makes you wonder if he knows some of the true history of the world as well. But anyways, as I mentioned in previous videos, I have a lot more on the way, and some more videos like this one talking about a specific object or concept in the context of One Piece. I'll end up using this video as a reference in my other videos. That way I won't need to take a 20-minute detour explaining why I think the red line is crazier than we think in the midst of a 60-minute video. Which I do want to add, this chunk of conversation was cut from my last video where I talk about how the Mother Flame will most likely resemble the fire on Luffy's head when he's in Gear 5, and how the ancient dynamic energy source fuel for their flame is probably simply a reference to the pilot of the series, Romance Dawn. And you're probably wondering how this video connects to that one. Well, for that, stay tuned because all my videos connect in one way or another. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next Parvision.